Jane Evans was a Welsh housewife and office worker in her 30s, and in the 1970s was hypnotised and regressed back to past lives by Arnold Bloxom, who was a respected practitioner and president of the British Society of Hypnotherapists. Jane had initially sought help from Dr. Bloxom about a physical ailment she was suffering from, where Dr. Bloxom then hypnotised her. But in an unusual twist, whilst under hypnosis, Jane Evans started to reveal past lives. Her earliest description of a past life was set in the 3rd century during the rebellion of Carausius, the Roman admiral who seized power in Britain and declared himself emperor. Jane Evans claimed to have been a woman called Livonia, who was a wife of a tutor by the name of Titus. They lived in the town of Eboracum in the year 286 AD. Eboracum was a fort in the Roman province of Britannia and was the largest town in northern Britain and provincial capital. It later developed into the present-day city of York in North Yorkshire, England. Titus's pupil was the son of Constantius, the Roman governor of Britain, and Titus and Livonia lived in a villa and were involved in much of the politics of the day. As Livonia, Mrs. Evans described how Constantius needed to return to Rome, and a rebellion was engineered while he was away, where the British revolted against Roman rule. The governor's wife Helena and son Constantine, including Titus and Livonia, were forced to flee from Eboracum and escaped to Verulamium, which is now called St Albans in Hertfordshire in southern England. In Verulamium, they lived in fear until the rebels were eventually overthrown by an army led by Constantius. Unfortunately, Helena's husband's triumphant return brought only sadness for her. Due to Roman power struggles, her husband was forced to divorce her, and a new marriage was arranged with Theodora, the daughter of Emperor Maximinus. Helena chose to stay in Verulamium with Livonia and Titus. In Verulamium, both Helena and Titus are influenced by Christian woodcarver by the name of Albinus, where Titus became fervently religious and volunteered for the priesthood. Before Titus could be ordained as a priest, Roman troops attacked Christian houses and burned them down, and Titus lost his life, and a short time later, Livonia also loses her life. Both Helena and her son Constantine survived. She later became Saint Helena, and her son Constantine would become Constantine the Great, the emperor who established Christianity as a religion throughout Roman Empire. Her next regression was in the same location in northeast England, where instead of Eboracum, the town is now called York. However, this time she is a Jewish woman named Rebecca, and the year is 1189 AD. Her husband's name was Joseph, who was a rich moneylender, and they lived in the wealthier part of town. She spoke with fear and anger about the attitude of the Christians, who, she said, would borrow money to finance their wars and build their cathedrals, then persecuted the Jews unmercifully in return. As with her previous life as Livonia, Rebecca was also murdered, this time at the hands of Christians during the York Massacre, where she, her husband, and 2 children attempted to hide in the cellar of a church outside the city gates. In her current life, Jane had had no knowledge or association with Jewish people or its culture, but under regression, she had an amazing knowledge of 12th century Jewish history, where she was able to describe the life of a Jewish woman living in York. She describes Jewish life at the period of time where they were forced to wear badges. She described a terrible massacre of the Jewish population by the local townspeople. Rebecca and her family had prepared to leave the city, but had left it too late, and were able to run only as far as the castle of York, but were unable to find safe shelter. They were then forced to take shelter in the crypt of a local church, where they took the priest and his clerk captive. From the safety of the church roof, they could see flames and hear people screaming, "Burn the Jews!" The priest and his clerk managed to escape and alerted soldiers who came into the church. It was at this point in her story that Jane appeared to be filled with terror as soldiers took away her daughter. Then she whispered, "Dark, dark." This was when they were apparently murdered. In order to verify what Jane Evans had described, an expert by the name of Professor Barry Dobson was called in. Professor Dobson lectured at York University and specialised on Jewish history, and was asked to verify the information that Jane Evans had given whilst under regression. He was extremely impressed at how accurate she was in describing life as a Jewish woman in 12th century York, and that many of her details would only have been known by professional historians. Professor Dobson determined that the church she'd hidden with her family would have been St Mary's Castlegate, but at the time he believed it would not have had a crypt, which she claimed they had hidden. He also claimed that Jews were not forced to wear badges until a later date. But on further research, they found that making Jews wear badges did take place in 12th century England, and several months later, researchers were doing renovations in St Mary's Castlegate and found a sealed chamber below the floor, which appeared to have been a crypt, which would have been a rare phenomenon for churches in the area. Jane Evans' regression brought forth details that proved to be historically accurate, and had yielded historical information that was not currently available at the time. Jane Evans then went on to describe other lives, which she claims she was an Egyptian teenager called Alison, who was a servant employed by a man called Jacques Coeur, who was a wealthy 15th century French merchant and financier, and confidant and advisor of King Charles VII of France, and would later become his treasurer. Alison described the life of a high-ranking Frenchman in the royal court, and about the king's mistress called Agnes Sorel, and the clash between the Dauphin Louise and King Charles VII. She talked about Coeur's possessions and his luxury house at Bourges in central France. She could accurately describe her master's clothing, which was a tunic edged with minever, red hose and shoes of red Cordovan leather with a jewelled belt around his waist. It appears that Alison was in love with him, and he was in love with her. Jane was able to accurately describe Jacques Coeur's fall from grace, where he was once close to the king, but after the death of Agnes Sorel, a rumour spread that Coeur had poisoned her. Records showed that Coeur was arrested and tried on a number of charges and imprisoned. However, Alison only knew about his arrest. Alison's life came to an end after taking poison that Coeur had given her as the king's soldiers had arrived to arrest him. Her next life was in much less detail, where she lived in the 16th century as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. Then much later, she described her life as a 17-year-old sewing girl who lived in London by the name of Anne Tasker around the year 1702. After that life, she was a nun called Sister Grace who resided in a convent in Des Moines, Iowa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who passed sometime in the 1920s. The regression of Jane Evans was shown on television, where the audience were amazed by her detailed stories, and were convinced that she was not acting, especially when she appeared to show genuine fear and emotion, and the way she was able to grasp the difficult names and places she had once been a part of. When Jane Evans was awake, she was adamant that she knew nothing about any of the lives she had described. Her televised regression became known as the Bloxom tapes, where a housewife from Wales was able to accurately convey a genuine knowledge and experience about the past. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. In the 1970s, Gwen MacDonald from Sydney, Australia, became involved in research in past life memories, where Gwen was initially reluctant. Under hypnosis, Gwen gave information about a home where she lived in the 18th century and spoke about people she knew and the villages that were around the area. She also spoke of a man named James Mackenzie, who she did not like, and his son Nicholas, who she found annoying. When she was first regressed, she described picking lemon balm, which was used to make hot drinks. She also said how they dried the hairs in a special room at the back of the house, and of old-fashioned recipes, utensils, and cooking methods. As Gwen was talking, she now took on a West England dialect. She lived in a small cottage with a thatched roof. She was asked what part of England she lived and what were the names of the surrounding villages. She said Alford, Blowerton, Stone Chapel, West Bradley, East Pennard. The year is 1780, and she lived in Somerset. Her father was Adam Duncan, and her stepmother was called Bessie. She spoke about Bessie's grandfather, an old man by the name of Dobbs, who told her stories. When she was 2 years old, she was taken in a cart with her father. She wore a long dress with a frill around the bottom, and she sat up in front of the cart. They came to a big house with a smaller cottage at the back where they lived. It was called Rose Cottage and was covered with roses. As she grew older, people called her Rose. Gwen described her young life as Rose as one of happiness and contentment. Her stepmother Bessie was a happy lady with a peaches and cream complexion. She wore full skirts, button-up boots in black, blouse buttoned at wrists and forearms, and if she was in the kitchen, she wore an apron. If she was going to church, she would dress slightly differently. She would put on her best wear. Most women wore off-the-shoulder dresses, but she didn't. She wore buttons up to the neck. She always wore a mop cap with frills. Bessie was a friendly, peaceful person and was caring. If something went wrong, she never told my father. Bessie was very tolerant and liked to make people happy. She said her father was a kind man who was strong and hard, but always kind. He was a big man with heavy thighs. He had light brownish hair, which hung down to his collar. He had a round face and a straight nose with blue eyes. He wore a mid-brown coat that hung down to his hips, not very flared. Corded heavy broadcloth trousers, also mid-brown, with black boots that came up to just below his knees. If he was going on the cart anywhere, he wore a brown waistcoat that matched the brown of his trousers and coat. His shirts were like serge material in the blue or cream. The cream ones he wore mostly when he was going somewhere. The shirts were puffed out, with puffed out arms that came in tight at the wrist. He was a Scot with a Scots skin and a ruddy complexion. She said her life was routine. When her father was away for days or weeks at a time, she spent most of her time talking to Bessie and old Dobbs. She lacked friends of her own age, so was forced to spend time amusing herself. The morning meal consisted of porridge that had been left to soak overnight, which caused it to swell, so that when it was ready to eat, it resembled tapioca. Sometimes they had bread with cheese, honey, or milk. They made their own soap and dried their clothes in the sun on a rope line between trees. It was her job to scrub the table that was made of timber and was bleached and scrubbed. There was no tablecloth, and the plates, utensils and assorted items were placed directly onto the table. Their home had a room for cooking and living. A bedroom for her father and Bessie had a loft on the roof, a small room for herself and a drying room out back. She would walk half a mile over the surrounding fields to Dobbs' place, where she would sew and mend for him and sometimes help him with other chores he needed doing. When all the chores were completed, she would go out into the fields and pick the vegetables for the table, but Bessie did most of the cooking. A number of times during the week, she would walk across fields, cross the stream at the stepping stones, and make her way to the nearest village to buy provisions. She enjoyed this task, as it was a chance to see all the beautiful merchandise, the silks and satins, and the dresses which she could never afford. There were new threads and products for the home, and foodstuffs. She loved to look at the new laces which were brought over from France, and it gave her a chance to meet and talk with the people of the village that she came to know well. It enabled her to get away from the house and from the chores, which to her were humdrum and repetitious. On the way back from the village, she would play for a while by the stream, jumping across the stepping stones that crossed it, and would meander through the long green grass. She spoke of Carlotta, the gypsy girl. She was not supposed to visit Carlotta, but would talk to the gypsies who camped there. She used to sneak out at night and visit the gypsies' camp to watch them dance. The gypsies knew she was there, but as she was only a child, they never seemed to mind. There were 7 caravans, all bright and multicoloured, with flowers and motifs painted on them. The men were of stocky build, with olive skin and dark hair. The women wore bright dresses, layered in many colours, with anklets and bracelets. The nearby wood was important in her life and was a place she found tranquillity and peace. Sometimes she passed through the woods on the way to the old abbey, or to a place she called the Druid's Ring. However, there were certain parts of the wood where she did not go, because of smuggling along the Parrot River, and to avoid those parts of the woods where she could run into trouble. Her family feared she might become implicated in the smuggling if she came to know too much about it, or was seen in the area where the smugglers used to pass or hide their contraband. It seemed that everyone in the village was involved in the smuggling, with different people and various shops being used to hide or sell the illegal products. Most of the smuggled items were brought from France, such as lace and fine cloths. Penalties were harsh. If one was caught, one was not likely to be seen again. For Rose, the smuggling had a romantic air and helped to bring some excitement into her boring life. She described the countryside with its hills, its beautiful trees and its marshy ground. She could see a spire or tower in the distance from where she stood, and spoke of the peaceful atmosphere of the place and how it never failed to fill her with a feeling of serenity and tranquillity. Rose loved to visit the old Glastonbury Abbey, which was a ruin about 7 miles from where she lived. She talked of the old buildings, of the rubble that lay about, and the long grass that grew around the ruins. Mr. Brown, who lives in the second house from the end, would take stones from the abbey to put on this floor. He shouldn't do that. Gwen then described the unique markings on the stone. One time Rose cut her foot, and Mr. Brown helped her and put her on the back of his cart and he took her to his house and he bandaged her foot to help her walk for the journey home. One day, as she'd grown older, they wanted Rose to marry a man she did not like, so she ran away to the Abbey, and when they finally found her, it was freezing cold and she was huddled in the corner of the building. They put her in the cart and took her home. She was quickly put to bed, but as each day passed, her energy became less and it became harder to breathe, and Rose died 3 weeks later. Gwen was then asked to recall her death. I saw a lady and a man wearing long robes, and the man put out his hand, and I took it, and I went with him. I began to feel very light, with nothing to hold me down. It was like floating, but not floating. There was no pain, and I was very aware of the feelings and senses and thoughts, and you didn't have to speak. It was like being made of air and so free. I remember standing beside the bed and looking down at my body. I'd wasted away, and I felt free. I was standing there looking at myself, and I wondered why Bessie was crying. Then I realised I was dead, and life was no more, and I couldn't go back. It was over. I knew she couldn't see me, nor could she hear me. I would have liked to talk to her, but I was dead. I was taken to a place and was told to rest. But I felt myself being pulled back because Bessie was feeling so sad missing me, and it was holding me back. I came down to see her again and tried to tell her to let me go because it hurts. She was then taken to a place where everywhere was grass and there was water similar to earth. You could put your feet into the water and take them out again without having to dry them, as they didn't get wet. We walked to the Hall of Records, and that was where I met a man who was kind. He showed me all I had done, things I should have done but didn't do. The place was like a library and it was full of records. It was a very big place. It had a long corridor with gold light everywhere inside. He showed me my life, but I could see it in my mind, not on paper. All the things I'd done, things I needed to do and didn't do. The thing I needed to do was to be more conscious of other people. I was selfish. I only thought about myself and where I lived, my home, and not the poor people in the village and the poor children. I should have helped, but I didn't. Gwen spoke of Langport, where she'd lived. Were they able to trace the name Langport, which was in the county of Somerset? They then located some of the villages and towns that she had spoken of. Some of the villages she mentioned no longer existed and had to search older maps to find them. One place, which Gwen called Blowerton, was now spelled Blotton. However, when they checked the old maps, they found that in 1790 the name of the village was Blowerton. She spoke of another village called Stone Chapel, which no longer existed, but did in the year 1782. The other villages she spoke about still existed, such as East and West Pennard, Bradley, Langport, Somerton, Taunton, and Crosscombe. Gwen spoke about her father and the trips she used to make down to the Blackdown Hills. Blackdown Hills are found in the lower region of Somerset, below Taunton. She also spoke about Parrot River and the Severn Sea, where she'd lived in the West Country. After following the river, they traced its course through the West Country, where Rose Duncan must have lived somewhere in that region. She also spoke often of a man called James Stuart Mackenzie and searched the records for the West Country of England. They came across a manuscript titled A History of Somersetshire, written in the 18th century and printed in 1794. The book showed the squires, gentry and nobility of Somersetshire who had lived during that period. On checking through the lists, they found the Honourable James Stuart Mackenzie, just as Gwen had told them. They then travelled to Somerset and checked the local historical libraries and confirmed that the Honourable James S. Mackenzie lived in the area at that time, along with some other people Gwen spoke of, and the names of some families they'd been involved with. Under hypnosis in Australia, Gwen talked about the Abbey and the rubble that used to cover the grounds, and the long grass that had grown up around the building, and the peaceful setting, the trees, the hills, and the haze that used to settle over the horizon. A haze they also noticed when they were there. She remembered the arches in the buildings, and the feathers that were etched out of stone on the sides of the arches and doors. The Abbey held very fond memories and was a very special place for her. It was also the place she had recalled running to prior to her death. The place where she'd suffered from hypothermia, caught pneumonia, and later died. They gave Gwen an old unmarked map of the area where the Abbey might be, and asked her to point to its position on the map. Gwen then pointed near Wirial Hill and correctly pinpointed Glastonbury Abbey. She was definite in her knowledge without any difficulty explaining when given the map. She pointed out graves and then a track where coaches used to come around. They then took Gwen to Glastonbury Abbey that she'd pointed to on the map, where she found herself standing outside a long, spiked iron railing, and inside was her beloved Abbey. She then proceeded to show them certain features on the doorway she'd previously described. Standing in this long-forgotten place sparked a lot of reflection. She sat on the very same rock where she remembered having sat 200 years before in 1782 as Rose Duncan. She also remembered her death, which was the last time she recalled having been inside the Abbey grounds. They checked Gwen's recall of the old Abbey and its surroundings from a 1790 description of the area, written in an old manuscript printed about 1794, which verified Gwen's description well. Gwen then pointed to a spot where 5 houses used to stand, but there was still the ruin of one old house nearby that dated back to her previous lifetime. They then approached the owner about houses that are now gone. Gwen asked the owner about the 4 or 5 houses, and he guessed yes, there were 4 or 5 houses that used to be here, confirming Gwen's recall. Gwen had recalled the position of 5 houses from her conscious memories, though she'd never been to that part of the world before in this life. Gwen was then taken to the house in which Rose Duncan used to live, and felt she was now on home territory. She spoke about a stream nearby, that the stream would fork a short distance from where they would join it, and there were stepping stones across the stream and a waterfall near the fork. She told them of a shortcut that was the quickest way to go, a shortcut that she recalled. They left the road and walked across the fields. It wasn't too long before they reached the stream as Gwen had predicted. How did she know it was there? And it was the size as she had stated it would be, and it wound through the country in the direction she said it would. Gwen was correct in so many ways and had an inexplicable knowledge of the area. They walked until they reached the fork in the stream, and was again where Gwen said it would be. Above the fork was a waterfall she had also described. Gwen then came close to where she thought she would find her home, and then stopped and pointed in the direction of her house. In the distance, obscured by a few trees, was the front of the house. The thatch on the roof had been replaced by tiles and had changed. The part that was once her home was now a garage, and attached to the side of a larger house was an old pigsty. Before going to the back of the house, they asked Gwen to draw it, and then they went around to compare her drawing. Gwen had sketched a back window, which she called the drawing room, and a back door. When they turned the corner, they found that her drawing was accurate. Gwen suddenly broke into tears for the first time and was overwhelmed. Gwen was back at the home she recalled in Somerset after 200 years. She recalled the inside of Mr. Brown's home and how its floor was covered with bluish-coloured stones taken from the Abbey. She described the unique markings on the stone she saw Mr. Brown put on the floor. In Sydney, while under hypnosis, she was asked to draw these markings on the stone she'd recalled on the back of the card. The stone also had the impression of 3 fingers on the top left-hand corner. That was the stonemason's mark. Gwen then pointed to a building which was currently not being used to live in, but was now a chicken shed. The floor was covered in dirt and droppings. The current owner told them that most of the floor was original, but was deep in droppings, and no one knew what was under the dirt. When the floor was cleaned, they could see the stones, large and rectangular, covering the floor, the same as the stones that lay in the Abbey grounds. It seemed that the paving stones that Mr. Brown had taken from the Abbey over 200 years ago and remembered by Gwen under hypnosis in Sydney, still lying on the floor of what once had been part of his cottage. When cleaned, they were impressive shades of blue, some with white veins running through them. They then levered the stone out, and after a thorough wash, they could see the markings more clearly, and after comparing the stone to Gwen's drawings, the similarity was obvious. The markings that Gwen had drawn on paper and talked about matched the stones. The markings on the left-hand side of the stone matched her description, and the large spiral was on the right-hand side of the stone. There was enough to show that Gwen's drawings of the markings certainly matched the markings on the old blue-grey stone that she'd led them to. Added to this were the 3 vertical lines on the top of the left-hand corner that Gwen had referred to as the 3 fingers. What were the odds of seeing under hypnosis in Sydney an incident recalled as happening some 200 years ago, where you went to a house, saw stones on the floor, one with markings in a country in which in this life you had never been to? You then find your way to and uncover the old house with its stones, though it's now a chicken shed, and find the exact stone with the markings on it you had drawn in Sydney, when the stones themselves have been buried under dirt for over 200 years, and the owner hadn't even realised they were there. Gwen had accumulated an impressive list of evidence, even though she'd never been to Glastonbury Abbey, not even to England. As a matter of fact, had never been outside of Australia. Gwen had found the very stone that she'd drawn in Sydney, a feat far beyond any element of chance. They were lucky that it was still there. All doubts about reincarnation had been dispelled. The following are two more amazing stories about reincarnation, where two people claim to have lived a past life. Philip Harding. Philip was only 2.5 years of age when he went to Oxford, England with his Aunt Rosemary. At such a young age, Philip had never been to Oxford, and if he had, he would have been too young to have observed anything that would have had any meaning. His Aunt Rosemary had only fleetingly been through on a coach, so neither would have had any knowledge of the ancient town. They had not been in the town very long when Philip asked his auntie whether they could visit the funny clock. She looked at him in a confused manner and said, "What funny clock?" Philip then went on to describe a large clock at the side of a church that had strange markings on its face. As his auntie had no idea what her nephew was talking about, she tried to change the subject by suggesting that they each get an ice cream and sweets while they were shopping. However, Philip was insistent, and his auntie had to admit that she had no idea where the church with the funny clock was. Then his auntie was totally surprised when Philip said, "Well, I know where it is, and I'll show you." Then Philip grabbed his auntie's hands and proceeded to guide her down back alleys and side streets, and all of a sudden, in front of her was a huge clock face. She then asked Philip how he knew about the clock face, and more surprisingly, knew exactly where it was. His response startled her even further, when he replied that he'd once lived here as a little boy called Andrew. 1 year later, his Aunt Rosemary was babysitting him, and he surprised her again by stating that, "When I was Andrew, I saw Thomas Becket being killed." She was again taken back, thinking, how does he know about Thomas Becket? Thomas Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1162 until 1170, when he was murdered by 4 knights in the Canterbury Cathedral on December the 29th, 1170. How did Philip know of such an historical event? Philip explained to his auntie that when he was a little boy called Andrew, he was older than he is now, and was 6 years of age. Andrew must have come from a family with money, as he claimed he was also able to write, which would have been very rare in those days. He said that for some reason he had left his home in Oxford to visit Canterbury, and must have been amongst the congregation gathered for service on that fateful night in December 1170, and witnessed the assassination of Sir Thomas Becket. Philip then went on to describe that when they were in the city before entering the cathedral, he saw lots of soldiers wearing masks on their faces, walking around the city. The soldiers had large swords, and their shields had drawings on them, and they were very noisy and shouting a lot. He said he was in the actual cathedral and heard him being murdered. He said that there were lots and lots of people in the church, where the men wore short dresses, which would have been tunics, while the women wore long dresses. Although he was only 6 years of age, he said he knew something very bad and serious was happening in the church. He said that he could not actually see Thomas Becket because there were too many tall people standing in front of him, but he knew that Thomas Becket had been killed. His Aunt Rosemary said that there was no way that a child as young as Philip would know anything about that famous event in history that had taken place hundreds of years before. Somehow, that historical event had left such a strong impression on a young 6-year-old boy named Andrew that 800 years later, the vivid images are still present in his incarnation as a young boy now called Philip Harding. George Neidhart. The following account of a previous life did not follow the typical pattern of hypnotic regression for George Neidhart. George was born in 1898 in Munich, Germany, and was brought up a Roman Catholic under a caring mother and a stern father, and between the ages of 5 and 7 had memories of previous lives, which he never experienced again until his 20s. When he left school, he started to learn his father's trade as a coppersmith, but at the start of World War I, had to give up his apprenticeship at the age of 19 when he was called up for service in the German Imperial Navy, where he trained as a radio operator. George fortunately survived the war and was demobilised on January 1st, 1919. He returned to his home city of Munich amidst revolution and violence, where an economic depression was now setting in, and George was unable to return to his apprenticeship. He then married and had a daughter, but within 2 years his wife had died, and he was still under 25 years of age. George's views on life were now completely shattered, and his belief in the divine justice made praying a struggle. He had no place of his own to live, and a friend allowed him to live in his house. However, it was during this period that George had an experience that affected him deeply and was to transform his life. It happened one spring morning after he had just eaten his breakfast, when an amazing mixture of images appeared in his mind. But he was not disturbed in any way, and his senses and thoughts remained clear. The images in his mind appeared to be from another period in time centuries ago. The images were so overwhelming and strange that he immediately felt that he needed to write everything down. For the next 10 days and much sleeplessness, the images finally came to an end. What he had found was that the scenes and images appeared to be that of a former life, and the details of the various names, dates and places gave everything a sense of plausibility. He also felt that he was able to identify with the principal figure of the whole picture, and it felt like something had risen up deep from the deepest layers within him. He then made efforts to verify all that he had experienced from the images in his mind, and concluded that he had not fallen into a delusional state when he had experienced the mental images. The inner visions that he had experienced had referred to a previous existence of himself. He came to the conclusion that earthly existences can serve as a punishment inflicted on a person as an outward expression of repentance for wrongdoing, and can extend over many earthly existences. His memories started with the description of a castle around the year 1150, which he had sketched, where the castle stood on a mountain above jagged rocks. Entrance to the castle was via a wooden drawbridge across a deep moat that surrounded the mountain. He was not able to get the name of the castle in his visions, but felt it was near a highway that was much travelled in that period of time. He spent the next few years searching for the location in an attempt to verify details, with some success, and began exploring the region in search of his past life. From the town of Regen, he set off into the Bavarian forest, using only his intuition. He eventually came to an opening on the peak of a mountain, where he found himself standing in front of the ruins of a castle, which had been erected high above rocks. Only the tower remained standing. He then climbed to the top of the tower to see the view of the surrounding area. After a short search, he came upon the remains of a secret passage he had remembered. He later saw an engraving from 1726, at which time more of the main building still stood, and it matched exactly the sketch that he had drawn. He emerged from his experience with a different view of life and death, and had altered his view of life.